focus then, India's energy transition is truly at an inflection point. While policies around solar manufacturing and advanced cell production are beginning to take shape, experts believe that much more needs to be done on the ground, particularly on implementation and energy efficiency. And to discuss this in greater detail, we now have Gauri Johar, Executive Director, Energy Transitions and Clean Tech Consulting at S&P Global. Gauri, afternoon, and thanks so much for taking your time out and joining us here on ET Now. And first up, if you can take our viewers through the latest trends that we are seeing as far as energy transition is concerned, both in India, especially when we compare India to the rest of the world. How is transition to green energy progressing versus the timelines that were set earlier?
I think, one of the most encouraging signs of the energy transition in India is that amongst India's climate commitments was to meet non-fossil fuel capacity about 50% by 2030, and we have already achieved that. So I think that is the government's big, intent that has panned out, which is a great sign, which means that we are progressing on renewable deployment at a very rapid pace. That said, I think when we look at our own projections and primary energy usage in India, in base case, we still see India, having fossil fuels, which is coal, oil, and gas, as foundational to its energy mix. It will require a far greater push on energy policies and implementation, regulatory implementation, especially at the states level, for a much more greener reality to take place. So if we want renewables in the primary energy mix to reach, close to 13-15% of the primary energy mix, we require a far greater push in terms of policies and their implementation. Apart from that, I think the intent that we've seen of the government to launch the nuclear energy mission in the budget this year, to launch the green hydrogen mission earlier a few years back of 5 million tons. These are all important ambitions. And we have seen a lot of action this year on the tenders on these missions, especially on hydrogen. It does remain to be seen, of course, how the implementation of the tenders that have been won and how sustainably it can be implemented and made sure that India also is able to realize its export ambitions with regards to green ammonia and green hydrogen. We do see, of course, in terms of timelines, whether you look at far-end technologies which are material in their impact, like hydrogen, even carbon capture, utilization, and storage, really beginning to have impact in the later timeframes of post 2035, 2040 timeframe, not immediately. I think immediately where India needs to focus is to make sure that we exhaust all our options on energy efficiency, on renewable deployment, and to also look at very hybrid solutions. And one of my favorite examples on that actually is the solarization of India's petrol pumps, wherein there's been a rapid pace of solarization of India's petrol pumps, where we do see the mix of, supplying liquid fuels, oil-based liquid fuels, but at the same time looking at adding EV charging stations and powering that whole petrol pump through solar deployment. So I think that is the type of hybrid solutions we need to see, that how can different parts of the energy mix really work together in terms of at the deployment level, seeing what makes the most sense from the least emission profile. So that's where I see India's energy transition story in the near term and panning out in the long term, in terms of the framework of what technologies can matter at into what time frames.
Understood. So that's as far as India's transition story is concerned, Gauri. But if you can also tell us, when you look at energy transition in India versus globally, what would you say are the biggest constraints that India is facing at the moment, and perhaps the government can work on it?
So I think India is one of the top countries in terms of renewable deployment. So India does compare very favorably to that. India has also launched on solar manufacturing, advanced cell chemistries manufacturing. So it is quite important to note that. That said, I think the two main constraints for India are land access and cost of capital. I think India's cost of capital still is much higher than other parts of the world, in terms of, there could be easily a 5 to 6 percentage point difference between some of the more favorable cost of capital versus India's. And that is very important to make sure that these projects are viable. These projects translate into actual rates of return of capital employed, which are more sustainable in portfolios, and that will attract more capital actually into the renewable sector. So that plus land access to me is the two most important variables.
Okay, and India also has ambitious targets when it comes to renewable energy, net zero, hydrogen, etc. Since we are talking about the constraints that India is facing, Gauri, if you can tell us what kind of policy levers do you believe are under-leveraged in India right now, and that government can probably provide some support which will accelerate India's journey towards energy transition?
I think the government has done great in terms of lowering the GST on the solar value chain. More GST reform is required on upstream services where the GST actually increased. So to increase domestic production, we need to reduce that GST burden that actually increased. We also need to look at bringing fuels like gas into the GST framework, because that can enable the transition, especially from coal to gas, wherein gas can be more favorable in the merit order to again reduce emissions and see in certain cases where it can meet peaking or mid-merit order needs as well. So I think that reform is needed. Apart from that, I think overall we need to push with a more market-oriented framework where we believe in markets far more, where we believe in the fact that the more we allow production increases to happen, allow market players to come in and really listen to the industry in terms of what is required for reform, the more we will see the kind of energy increases in especially domestic production that we've seen in some other parts of the world. I mean, a classic question often asked is, when can a shale revolution happen in India? And of course, these questions have to be answered based on a resource base, right? So what is the resource base of the country? But I think the interesting thing is that right now, the mood of the nation is to reform more, to pull all the stops that there are in terms of any future reform that is needed. And in that, we should study from some best practices, both within India, but also outside India. So for instance, look at even contractual mechanisms like contract for differences, which can enable hydrogen deployment like that, the kind that are being looked at in South Korea and Japan right now, and really learn from the best case studies, both within India and outside India.
Okay, so that's the kind of government support probably India needs in order to accelerate its energy transition journey. Gauri, thanks so much for taking your time out and joining us here on ET Now. But shifting focus to our next segment, did you know? And today we put the spotlight on iPhone because the metals inside your